On September 11th, 2001, this country suffered one of the deadliest terrorist attacks on American soil in the history of the United States. The events of 9/11 took place in New York City, Washington, D.C., and Shanksville, Pennsylvania. All experienced extensive death and destruction because of these outrageous attacks. Some 2,750 people were killed in New York, 184 at the Pentagon, and 40 people in Shanksville, where the hijacked United Airlines Flight 93 crashed after passengers attempted to regain control of the plane from the terrorists. In New York City, the police and fire departments were especially hard hit. A total of 71 law enforcement officers, representing 10 different agencies, were killed that day. In addition, in the last 20 years, more than 200 police officers have passed away due to illness that they developed due to working in hazardous conditions. For the firefighters in New York City, the death toll was far more significant. A total of 343 firefighters were killed while responding to the attacks of the World Trade Building. To date, an additional 227 firefighters have died from illnesses related to their exposure to toxic chemicals. The number is expected to climb as many others involved in the operations on 9/11 are sick and dying. Firefighters are members of a unique brotherhood. Many members of the Philadelphia Fire Department volunteered to go to New York City on 9/11. Many made the trip to the site on their own, and the Philadelphia Fire Department organized a group of individuals from Heavy Rescue 1 with the Pennsylvania Task Force 1 to respond to aid the FDNY. As a tribute to the lives lost and the many people affected by this horrific event, we have decided to commemorate the 20th anniversary of 9/11 by recording interviews of the members and people that responded on that day. We hope that through these interviews, we will memorialize the role of the Philadelphia Fire Department and that you, the viewer, will learn more about the contributions they made.
Dan Moynihan is a former New York City Fire Department firefighter. He's retired now, but he's like some of the other people who are at ground zero. He has some baggage, both physically and maybe mentally, from what happened at ground zero. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But Dan, thanks for the time to bring us your perspective on what you saw and what happened there. So let's start at the beginning. What were you doing when you saw what you saw?
Good morning. Well, first of all, I was a firefighter from Freeport, which is just outside of New York City on Long Island, just outside of Queens. That morning, I was in the city working with my friend Jimmy, who is a New York City firefighter. We were doing a Tropicana juice truck, delivering juice to stores. Sure. Normally had the radio on. We were talking about baseball that morning, so we didn't have it on. Where we were positioned in Manhattan, we were on the Lower East Side, so our vision of the Trade Center complex was obscured, so we didn't see anything. We heard a bunch of sirens, but it's Manhattan, so you always hear a bunch of sirens, so you don't pay any mind. We pulled up to one of our customers. I jumped out to take the order, ran in, looked up at the TV screen. That's when I saw what happened. Went out and told Jimmy to turn the radio on. Long story short, there was a recall for New York City firefighters. So Jimmy had to take the Tropicana truck back to the Tropicana yard, get his Jeep and go to his Brooklyn firehouse. We were waiting to get on the 59th Street Bridge. Looked right out, looked at the NQR subway station. I said, Jimmy, be safe. He knew exactly what I was going to do. He said, you too. Jumped out, went on the subway, not realizing that they were in fact emptying all the subways out at 23rd Street. So everything was backed up. So I just wanted to get above ground, but I couldn't because I was in a subway car in a tunnel, pacing back and forth. Finally got above ground at 23rd Street, ran across to 7th Avenue, And I remember it being like a movie. There was an FBI agent there with the windbreaker, and he had the, just like he did out of the TV stuff. And he stopped me, and I showed him my ID card, fire department ID card. And he said, "Oh, okay, go, go, go." And just then, this a Verizon pickup truck with about 4 of the firefighters in the back pulls up, sees me showing him my ID card, picks me up. One guy had a bag of gloves. One guy had a bag of dust masks. They tossed me dust mask and gloves. What I didn't realize is either when I was on the subway or when I was trying to get across the 7th Avenue, what I didn't know was the South Tower had collapsed. Looking down, it was all obscured by dust and smoke. Couldn't tell. On the way down, we switched over, zigged over to Broadway, and on the way down, the North Tower collapsed. We got dropped off at Murray and West Broadway, which I don't know how familiar anybody is with that part of town. It's just 3 blocks north of the complex. That's when I realized everything had come down. I remember thinking to myself, I wonder how many friends I just lost, because I knew I lost quite a few. But my mind, I shut my mind down, my brain went to work, walked down a couple of blocks, there was an engine sitting on a hydrant. The block leading up to the complex was just filled with burning fire engines and ambulances and police cars. We needed to put those out just to approach the complex. By now, people were starting to come out of the dust, which I hadn't seen before. It felt very lonely for a few moments.
But you've got a mask, you've got some gloves, but you've got no bunker gear on.
Right. I had a t-shirt, shorts, sneakers. It was a beautiful day. So we stretched lines. We got water to this engine. We stretched lines off of the engine. We were putting fires as we proceeded down West Broadway, put the fires out. As we're proceeding down West Broadway, we started hearing explosions, which we thought were secondary bombs. What it turned out to be was the tires on the trucks.
Sure.
Blowing up, echoing off 7 World Trade Centers on one side, the federal buildings on the other side. So it was just echoing off everything, made it sound very loud. We thought they were secondary devices. We finally wound up making our way down, extinguishing all the fires we could. 7 World Trade Center was burning. There was nothing we were going to do about that. We checked the buildings, got down to the complex. By now, the dust masks we had were useless. We just pulled them off because they were sucking down our face with all the stuff that they were. You
and your colleagues are all professionals, but I know there's a chain of command. Somebody has to be organizing this fight to get to the scene. Who's saying, "Hey, you take this and you do that"? What's happening that way?
At the very onset, after the towers, there was originally a command post.
Sure.
There was a command post in each of the towers. Then there was a command post outside. After the towers had collapsed, the command post that was outside, a lot of the folks that were there, a lot of the senior chiefs, they were unfortunately no longer there. More of an experience, as people descended back on the scene, people who had dispersed, who were coming back, and people like myself who were just arriving just as the North Tower collapsed. It was more of an experience thing. You knew what you had to do. You didn't have to necessarily be told to do so. You grouped together. It's like, okay, let's get water to the rig. Let's stretch lines, put water. And then after the initial get the fires out on West Broadway and get back to, that's when it became more of a, okay, you're a lieutenant, so you're going to take charge of this group here.
Got it.
Or captain. That's after the initial, I'd say probably 45 minutes or so after the North Tower collapsed, maybe a little bit more. There was more of a chain of command came back in. They were grouping reserve guys up at firehouses to come in if need be. There was a chain of command that then came back into place, but initially it was more relying on your experience.
Just professionals reacting.
Right, right.
How long were you on the fire grounds?
The first day I got down there about just after the North Tower collapse, so about 10:30-ish. I got taken away to what is now Cobble Hill. NYU Cobble Hill was Long Island College Hospital, ER then in Brooklyn, about 2:30 in the morning with smoke inhalation, dehydrations. And so I got taken away 2:30 in the morning that day, but I returned and I was on the fire ground. I was on the location itself for about a month.
As you're on the grounds initially, those first couple days, can you describe how what happened finally is settling into your mind, and the more you're thinking about it? I mean, it's I was there and just awestruck. You were there day after day after day. Give me some adjectives about what went through your mind and what was going on psychologically for you.
There was a lot of, I think a lot of what you had to do was sort of numb yourself out to what was going on. Because if you didn't push stuff into the back of your head, then you weren't going to be able to operate. You weren't going to be able to do what you needed to do. Every now and then when you step back, every now and then if you were there, I knew the area pretty well. I knew what was north, south, west, and east, but all of a sudden, when you're surrounded by piles of building that are now 10 or 15 stories tall, and you're looking up and you're trying to get your bearings, you can't get your bearings anymore. You need to get a hold of a building that's in a certain spot just to figure out where you are.
Yeah.
And that's sometimes when things would kind of sink in a little bit. So we needed to sort of shake that off a little bit, because you knew that you were looking for your friends. You knew that you were looking for people you knew, and you knew that you're looking for other people that you knew trying to get home to their families.
Any PTSD for you in relation to this?
It's better now. It took me a long time to get into therapy. I started to sign up for a therapist at one point, but then shook it off. And 4 years in the Marine Corps and 20 years in the fire department, and you don't talk about this stuff.
Yeah.
I finally did. It was the best thing I did. But yeah, there's a lot of PTS that's.
Well, I bet you I did a half a dozen stories on guys who worked the fire grounds for the time that you did, and all of a sudden came down with mysterious maladies is the best word for me to describe it in a generic term, and some of them have passed. Cancers, lung problems. Your reflection on that and any problems you may have had, if that's not too personal a question.
No, not at all. Well, it's certainly no mystery that these maladies are there. There's 68 known cancers that are appearing in high volumes that in younger age groups that should not be appearing. I helped work on the bill, the healthcare bill and the compensation bill that finally got passed through Congress that took a lot more than it should have. So 68 known cancers. There's rhinosinusitis, sinusitis, COPD. There's neuro conditions. I've got 3 different neuro conditions they trace back to my work at the Trade Center. I have lung conditions. I had a brain tumor taken out that is supposed to be rare, supposed to be 1 in 100,000 people. I know 2 other guys who work the pile have the same brain tumor, but they have not officially designated that as being. There's a lot of stuff still a lot of autoimmune conditions that are popping up like crazy that they have not yet officially assigned to. So there's still a lot of work to be done there, but there's an awful lot of stuff health conditions that are really wreaking havoc in our community.
You know, you belong to a very specific band of brothers, so to speak. Can you talk about either the camaraderies or the connections, or do you all just kind of go your separate ways?
It's you know, I'll give you a perfect example. First of all, being in the fire department, you're already
A specific band of
put us
brothers.
together. Yeah,
Right.
You know, I met Brian to begin with in the Philadelphia Fire Museum. We just automatically we were family to begin with. This kind of brings it up a little bit more of a. I don't really talk about a lot of this to a lot of people until I meet somebody who was there, and then all of a sudden the floodgates open up.
Mhm.
There was once a year there was an open night at the Museum of Memorial for First Responders and their families, and one year there was an exhibition of a FEMA photographer. She took these phenomenal pictures, and that was up. And there was a retired firefighter. I didn't know him, but I was in the hallway, and all of a sudden he was like, "Oh yeah," he said to his wife and his kids, blah blah blah. I forget what the heck he said, but it struck a nerve, and it reminded me of something. I said, "Hey brother, remember when?" And we started talking, and sure enough, his wife and kids were like, "Okay, you boys talk. We're gonna back off." And turned out there was the senior oral historian for the memorial and museum just happened to be in the hallway.
Oh, no kidding. Wow.
And kind of like stood off in the corner and listened to us for a few minutes. And later on, just very gently came up and asked me a couple of questions. And I said, "Yeah, I saw you." And I saw his name tag. He had the jacket on. I said, "Does that happen very often?" He said, "What?" I said, "You know, us talkings." Well, not often enough, to say the truth.
Oh, interesting.
But that instant of like him having, you know, us both having been there and that commonality, that's what, you know, all of a sudden you're off to the races and you can talk. Because I kind of say it's like if you're in the military and you're in combat, you don't talk about a lot of things unless you talk to somebody else who was in combat, and there's a commonality and understand.
Well, let me send you off with this quick story. I was standing at ground zero maybe 18 hours after the first tower went down, where they would let the press go down there. And I'm standing next to a hard hat, and he's looking at this pile of concrete and granite and stainless steel. And he said, "They don't get it." And I looked at him, and he's not looking at me. He's just staring at this pile. He said, "They just don't get it." He still doesn't make any eye contact with me. And then he says, "The strength of this country isn't its buildings. The strength of this country is its people." And he turned around and walked away. Dan Moynihan, you're one of those people that's the strength of this country.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Well, Craig Murphy is the first deputy commissioner of the Philadelphia Fire Department, but 20 years ago, he was a lieutenant with the fire department in Philadelphia, but he found himself at ground zero. So, Commissioner, if you will explain to us why you went there and what you learned there, please.
Sure, that's I appreciate it, Terry. So let me make a quick correction. 20 years ago, I was a firefighter. I hadn't gotten promoted until 2003. So
I beg your pardon. Okay.
No problem, no problem. So the reason that I was at ground zero wasn't just myself. It was a group from Pennsylvania Task Force One. And Pennsylvania Task Force One is the FEMA's urban search and rescue response component that is one of 28 federal task forces that responds to disasters, both man-made and natural.
So you go up there to help or to learn or both?
So it's a great question. So we went up there on that day to help. But previously, as we go through our training, New York has a task force, New York Task Force One, and we're surrounded by task forces. There are 8 of them in the Northeast, So we had trained to some of the folks that were working at Ground Zero, and unfortunately, some of the folks that were lost at Ground Zero. So we went up to help.
When you got there, give me your impressions. I don't want to say what did you see, because we've all seen those pictures, but give me your impressions of the site.
Okay, so when we first got to the site, the first impression that I got once we left the Jacob Javits Center, and that's where our base of operation was. I believe that was in Brooklyn. And then we rolled down we were transported via Army National Guard trucks down to Ground Zero, down the West Highway. And during that ride, what stands out to me is, we didn't get on the actual World Trade Center site until September the 12th. Now we got into New York on September the 11th, but that was late at night, and then we had to set up at the Javits Center and then do everything we had to do to position ourselves there. But as we were coming down the West Side Highway, the thing that sticks out to me is the support from everyone who was there. I mean, the West Side Highway was just lined with people, and we weren't the only vehicle. There was a convoy of probably 10 to 12 deuce and a halves that were taking us to Ground Zero. And I mean, it was the cheers, and it was, the signage, and it was the support from, I don't know if I've ever seen anything quite like it before that date. And I know I've never seen anything like it since that date.
I had some of the same impressions. You and I got there at the same time. We both went up there on the 11th, but by the time we got to the actual site, getting through everything, it was, the clock had passed. But when you're standing there looking at this pile of rubble and the concrete and what used to be marble and stainless steel, were you humbled? Were you afraid? Awesome?
Understanding that, in our role as rescuers, as rescue technicians, what we went up there for, we're always humbled. You're always humbled by any kind of situation where, a building has been compromised and you're working in a compromised area. Although you had 210, 220 stories worth of buildings sitting in front of you that had been reduced pretty much to about 6 stories over 16 acres. We go up there humble in heart, here to help. And that's exactly what we did. Taking in the whole site, as you said earlier, dust, the concrete dust, it looked like snow. There was so much of it. In the air, it smelled like burnt paper. There was so much of it. And the one thing that stands out to me about the site itself is the smell was of burning paper and jet fuel.
You know what I remember is, even on that West Highway from a distance, there was that 5th building that was still smoldering and smoke was still coming from it. So it was almost war zone-like the closer you got to it like that. Let me ask you this, Commissioner. Why do you think firefighters are, I don't want to say trained, but they're always the first line of defense? In this case, there wasn't a fire, but the fire department was the lead unit on working that scene. What makes firefighters so adept at a situation like that?
Well, understanding, it's a great question, Terry. Understanding how we train and what we are trained for. Any incident starts as any incident starts as a small incident for firefighters, and then usually expands and expands and expands. And firefighters train under the Incident Command System and National Incident Management System. So those two systems have scalability. And as the situation gets larger, we tend to lean forward because we understand that this could grow past our normal. And then what do we do next? What's the next step? Prepare for the next step. Don't wait for the next step before you make that step, but already have your mindset leaning forward, getting updates from everyone who happened to be on that scene, and agency support. So understanding that when, and this goes back to your question about humility, understanding that when all of the federal task forces, and I believe there were 8 or 9 of them that day, when all of the federal task forces got there, we understood who had control of that site. And who had control of that site was the fire department of New York, because it was a fire incident. I mean, there were fires burning below us as we were working. It was a fire incident. Understanding that, we're in bunker gear, we're in the proper PPE, and we understand that although we're not in charge, we understand that as this spreads out and has grown larger, that now we don't report to command specific, but report to an area command. And firefighters learn this through their training. As you at the task level as a firefighter, you learn it. Then as you make your steps through promotion, you understand that that's how it is. It grows in scale, and so can our ability to work that scene.
What did you bring back knowledge-wise as a firefighter or a FEMA operative that will help us the next time this happens, or to prevent a next time from happening?
I don't know if there's anything that we can do to prevent this from happening. Things happen. If you remember, in 2014, we had the situation at the Salvation Army collapse here in Philly. Not as grand in scale, but sort of the same type of event. It was a building collapse, and then now you were searching a compromised structure, searching for people, and that's exactly what happened in New York. So the takeaway coming, to answer the first half of your question, the takeaway coming out of New York was we have to rely on our training. We have to rely on everything that we've been trained to do and when to fall back on that training. So I say this to say there are units in fire departments nationwide that are trained in certain tactics. Understanding that those people who are pretty much technicians in technical rescue, they understand that piece of it. They understand the technical rescue piece. They understand the piece where we go in and do what we would not normally do as firefighters who haven't had that training. So the biggest piece that we got out of New York was rely on your training and do whatever you can to assist. Be humble and work hard.
Commissioner, thanks for your insight and thank you for your time. All right, well, 2 other people that bring a perspective about what happened in New York 20 years ago are Delaware Valley people that you may know, maybe not. Greg Masi, we affiliate with the Second Alarmers in the Philadelphia area. He's done a great job with that, but his perspective is from that of a Philadelphia police sergeant working for the city. Maggie Strucker was a citizen back then and is part of the Fireman's Museum now, and she has her own unique reasons for wanting to remember what happened at 9/11 and how the museum is going about doing that. So let's start with Greg Masi first. And Greg, where were you when it happened, and what did you do after it happened?
So the morning of the incident, Terry, I was actually in the 911 center working my normal shift. And as soon as we were aware that the country was under attack, they activated the Emergency Operations Center. And at that, when the center is activated, it's kind of like a deployment of multiple agencies that have to report. Since I worked in the communications division, It was my job to go over with some additional people, and we responded right to the Emergency Operations Center. And we manned that center throughout the day, getting various information from various both federal, state, and local agencies, what was occurring around the country during the incident itself.
Were we on, I use the word standby, but that's not really what I mean. You know, there's like DEFCON 1, DEFCON 2, DEFCON 3. Where was the city as far as wanting to know what's going on?
Well, we were in what they call full activation. When they activate the EOC, there's full and there's kind of partials. But they realized there was so much information that was coming in that day from the event, and they weren't even sure if Philadelphia could be a potential target, because at the time, you know, we were aware of what happened in New York City at the Pentagon in Shanksville, but believe it or not, there were still some unaccounted aircraft that could not be located. If you remember that day, everything was completely grounded at some point, but there was a couple aircraft that had transponder issues that were turned off, and one of them was actually bound for Philadelphia from Paris, and they could not locate that plane. So we were concerned, where was the plane at, and was Philadelphia a potential target? So there was a lot of information flowing back and forth between various agencies, and then fortunately for us, they did locate the aircraft and it did make a safe landing.
But you know, Greg, if you play that out in your mind, nothing would have as big an impact as flying a plane into Independence Hall or the Liberty Bell just for what they stood for. So it's really easy in retrospect to look back and say that really would have been a good potential target.
Yeah, when you think about it, Terry, we're kind of like a safe haven. When you talk about New York City, 90 miles away, and then Washington, D.C., exactly the same. You know, Philadelphia has been very, very fortunate over the years because we do have a lot of historical sites at our city here. So it was a concern, definitely a genuine concern that day, but we were in a full activation, being prepared for the worst, but fortunately for us, it wasn't, to be.
Now, did you go up to ground zero also, Greg?
Yes. So at the time, Terry, I'll bring you back. At the time, the commissioner of the police department at the time was former John Timoney. And John Timoney, if you remember, he came from New York. He was a deputy commissioner, and at the time he landed a job here as our commissioner. So when the incident occurred, of course, we knew that John Timoney had major concerns because a lot of his colleagues worked in the police department at the time. So I think he was concerned what was going on. So later that day, while I was at the EOC, I got contacted by my commanding officer, and John Timoney wanted to set up what they call a first observation team from Philadelphia. And it was comprised of myself, former Deputy Commissioner Charles Temporelli, Captain Chris Werner, who's still in the department today, he's a chief inspector, and one individual, Officer Mike Vincent from our crime scene unit. And basically our job was to go up to New York the very next day and to find out what we can do to assist them, and also get on some fact-finding information that may assist us in the future. And what I mean by that is that one of the things when we went up to New York the very next day, I can't tell you, things that you would never see, even in some of the broadcasts that'll be coming up in a few weeks to History Channel, to be up there at ground zero and see firsthand what happened, less than 24 hours before the incident. It's just an unbelievable sight. But my expertise was in communications. And if you remember, when World Trade Center 1 and 2 were taken down, a lot of communication equipment for both the police and fire reside on the top of that building. So they had a communications issue from the very beginning. Even to this day, the police department and the fire department couldn't talk to each other during the event because they were on separate systems. And to bring back in perspective, Philadelphia was just on the verge of completing a new digital radio system for the city of Philadelphia. And when we looked at this radio system, it was going on for years. The city was undecided, do we make one system or do we make two separate systems so one could be redundant of another? So if something should happen catastrophically, we could rely on a backup. And believe it or not, this was the catalyst for Philadelphia to move forward to make sure we have two separate systems in the event there was a catastrophic event here.
Let me back up a minute here, Greg. Give me your impressions when you stood there behind the sawhorses at the base of Ground Zero.
The first thing I noticed, Terry, there was a sea of responders, both police and fire, both working together, as well as, this is probably the untold story of, when you talk about civilians, I really think the true heroes were the immense amount of construction workers that responded to the scene with heavy equipment. They were really the ones that were really trying to untangle a lot of this to see if we can get to any survivors. And there was so many of them. And the unfortunate thing what's happening today, as you may be aware, that the 9/11 incident, we know how much loss of life we occurred at the various Pentagon, Shanksville, New York. But today, the loss of life is still continuing from 9/11 illnesses. It's just amazing. And it's an unfortunate thing, because at the time, no one thought that this dust would be an issue, but it really is. Yep.
Maggie, let's get you into this. Before we talk about your connection with this, with the museum, where were you and what were your impressions?
Well, I was watching television, running out the door to work, and saw the first tower come down, horrified, of course. So by the time I got to Sparks, we were all watching the television, and then the second tower came down, and of course we were shocked, speechless, crying. I mean, I've never seen so much emotion from my colleagues before.
You're very involved in education at the museum. Explain to the viewers how we're trying to make sure that people here in Philadelphia don't forget what happened there and the sacrifices.
The managers of Sparks, after all this happened, they wanted to do something that we could contribute. Sparks is an exhibit manufacturing facility nationwide, and we really wanted to make a contribution. My biggest challenge was to find something to do, because I reached out to people in New York, but of course, the flurry of activity, my request was way down the line. I walked down to our local fire station, and Captain Troy listened to my story, and he said, well, you know what? Maybe you should talk to the president of the Firefighters Union. Tom O'Drain said, well, you know what? Let me call the commissioner. And Commissioner Harrison said, well, you know, I'm at Fireman's Hall right now. We were just talking about this. So why don't you bring her down? He connected me with Terry Maggie, who is the curator of the museum, and Tom Garrity, who was working at fire prevention as the chief of fire prevention at the time. And together we came up with a scheme. We had several meetings. When I went back to Sparks and worked with our designers, we determined that we needed some images and perhaps some artifacts. One thing I was watching was the story on the Dateline, I believe, about David Hanshoe. David Hanshoe was a photographer for the Daily News, and he was known for covering fire incidents. And he said, well, you know, I really don't have much, but you should talk to a person at the New York Gallery, which was set up at the time for professionals and amateurs to submit their photos. And those photos of the events would be put on sale, and the proceeds would go to a fund. My next step was to find the photos of all of the firefighters that were lost. And I went to the New York Times, actually, because they had published those photos. And I have to say, during this whole search, meeting the people at This Is New York Gallery and Phyllis Collazo, who were so willing to help, it was very moving for me. the next piece of that puzzle was artifacts. So I contacted John Norman, who was the battalion chief at the time, who actually replaced the battalion chief that was lost. And I will never forget walking into the room.
Point of clarification, Maggie. Was this New York Fire Department or Philadelphia Fire Department?
New York Fire Department. John Norman was very kind to see me. And when I walked into their offices, I was struck by how professional, how gracious, but how sad everyone was. So John was kind enough to provide some pieces of apparatus, small pieces that we could use in our display. Also some dust from the site. And I will never forget driving home in my Volkswagen Golf with these artifacts and this dust, thinking to myself, these are relics. And it was such a moving experience. It actually quite changed my life. The kindness, although through all their sadness, the willingness to help me, it made me think that, you know what, life is short. I'm going to do what I want to do. So I pursued that. But after a few months, we came up with a design, and it was installed and opened in March.
How far off from 9/11, the day of, are we talking? Months, years? How
Just
far out?
months, just months. You know, the events happened in September, and our exhibit was installed in March.
When you're at the museum, do you see people stopping and paying attention? Do they just whisk on through as you know, excited kids do it? How much of it is contemplative for what's there?
I think it's very moving to most visitors that see it. I think it's a great memorial to that day in history. And our goal was to keep that moment alive, not just to post images, but to make it moving for anyone who wasn't even born then. See what happened on that day.
Greg Masi, what are your thoughts on these types of exhibits and what they bring to the table?
Well, I think it's important, Terry, that people should never forget. When you think about what's happened to this country over the last 100 years, I mean, when I wasn't born for Pearl Harbor, but I've studied the history of it. And I think it's important that 9/11 continues on the same time frame as Pearl Harbor. I mean, as I said before, a lot of the firefighters and police officers that I've had company with now, some were just youngsters and very young teenagers at the time. So I think it's important these exhibits continue to tell the story, and we should never forget what happened and heroic acts by so many people, both responders and civilians. Because there's a side of the civilians that I think people tend to forget. There was a lot of heroic acts by civilians as well that day, and especially there and also at the Pentagon.
Yeah.
Thank you for watching this special presentation. We would like to thank all our guests, moderator Terry Ruggles, Philadelphia Fire Department's first Deputy Commissioner, Craig Murphy, FDNY firefighter Dan Moynihan, retired Philadelphia Police Sergeant Greg Masi, and Philadelphia Fire Department Historical Corporation board member Maggie for sharing their stories. It was our intent to feature those that served that day, to highlight the many of those involved that came from afar to help the effort. The Philadelphia Fire Department was honored to assist with the work being done in New York City, while the events of 9/11 took place many miles from the city. Its impact on the community hit close to home. The museum decided early on that we would create an exhibit to honor the fallen. We're proud of the fact that we were the first museum in the country to build and display pictures and artifacts from that day. This video will become part of that display. With the 20th anniversary of 9/11 happening this year, the recording of personal and oral histories of those involved will be a key component to remembering and memorializing the events for posterity. To all the police officers, firefighters, EMS, and healthcare workers across the nation who answer the call every day, thank you for your service and God bless you. We hope you'll take some time to come visit our museum located in the Old City section of Philadelphia in the future. We look forward to having you, and until next time, thank you.